Fragments is a new play about a lost play. It is inspired by the surviving scraps of a lost play from ancient Greece,
which was really famous in antiquity. It was celebrated by Aristotle, who called it one of the best Greek tragedies, but only tiny bits of it survive. Nobody's heard of it nowadays. The original play hasn't been staged in thousands of years.
And it's the story of three scholars, three specialists, who are trying to piece this play together and make sense of what was going on in it, even though there's only just tiny bits of it remaining.
So on one level, it's a play set in a papyrologist's office. And on another level, it is an exploration into why we believe what we believe, how we come to those conclusions, and how we love to see patterns in things, why we love telling stories.
The ancient play that has inspired us is called Cresfontes. We know it's a revenge story about a boy seeking revenge for his murdered father and brothers. We know quite a lot about it. We know the myth that it came from. So we could just reconstruct it, put it back together, write a new ancient play.
But we weren't really interested in doing that. We wanted to celebrate the gaps. We thought it was really important to the project that we did something that was all about fragments. So I work on Greek literature, in particular Greek tragedy and early Greek poetry. We've got 32 complete plays, and yet there are these thousands of fragments that are in this incredibly rich resource, and that potentially could expand our understanding of Greek drama.
There are papyrus fragments in collections all over the place. There are some in the British Library, in the British Museum. There's a huge collection in Oxford called the Oxyrhynchus Collection. And we were lucky enough to visit all these places, talk to some of the experts and specialists who work with them about how they treat them, how they conserve them.
My work on papyrus fragments at the moment consists of publishing unpublished fragments of Greek poetry from papyrus, from deciphering the script to figuring out what is written on these fragments, and when there's a gap, trying to figure out what might have been in the gap.
For the most part, they're studied in a very technical way about reconstruction, about trying to identify what play they come from, which of course is all really important scholarly work.
If it's only a few letters or a syllable that are missing, it's relatively easy, but sometimes the gaps are much, much bigger, and then you have to resign yourself to not knowing.
I just became interested in the idea of how can we bring these fragments back to life? Could we make them somehow a piece of performance art again, rather than something that is only looked at in really analytical, intellectual terms?
I was really excited by the way that when you hear those fragments out loud, you're immediately drawn to ask, but what was the next line? What's just outside that? What's missing? Why was someone saying that?
The gap, yes, is really frustrating, but what's around the gap is exciting. I think what draws me to papyrology is this aspect of looking at what's forgotten and looking at what's broken and trying to bring back to memory what's forgotten. And what's broken, you can't really make it whole again, but you can make it a little less broken if you study it with patience.
I was interested in the question of, as a theatre maker, what do you do when the text runs out? And for me, that really connected with this really human thing, which is how much of our lives we do experience as fragments and gaps, where we misremember something, we have different versions of what happened, where we see something through a window and we draw a conclusion about what it is that's there. It's like our minds are hardwired to gloss over the gaps that we experience in our lives.
In order to even start working on these texts in the first place, you need to have some background knowledge, some context knowledge, and you can't not use that in your work as a papyrologist. So it's a matter of trying to tread that fine line between making wild assumptions and just keeping silent.
Fragments has been a really collaborative process for quite a long time, and we asked all of our creative team to respond in different ways to how we could present the audience with fragments.
We looked at the way that they handled those materials. The reason that we ended up using OHPs, because they also use light boxes. We wanted to get as close to that world as possible and see what kind of tricks we could use to approximate that world, but also give ourselves space for magic making.
How little of an image do you need for an audience to start to see it? How can puppetry images come out of the language of working with papyrus, of conserving it, and to try and create the sense that the story is literally coming out from papyri themselves?
This idea that this is an artefact that was held and used by an ancient actor staging this play in antiquity, that's quite inspiring to think about the people behind the play and the long performance history that it's had.
There is that feeling of awe sometimes when you realise that you're looking at something that's maybe 18 centuries old and which a half dozen people maximum have clapped their eyes on since the end of antiquity.
I think Fragments is going to be fun and irreverent and absurd. It's a celebration of stories and storytelling. It's a celebration of the way that having just part of a story is a huge creative force. When we don't know everything that's going on, suddenly we are free to imagine so much more.
There's so much in it. There's bound to be something in it that you'll be like, oh, I didn't know that.
Although some of the ideas that underpin the piece sound quite deep, then actually I think it's a really playful, light-hearted show. And I think that's come from the collaborative process that's driven it all the way through.
It's such a niche subject that we're looking at that, number one, that's super duper fascinating. And it's beautiful, it's magical.
We will be thrilled to watch the show in order to see how this material, which is often neglected, even by scholars, never mind by creatives, can be put together and brought to life. How the fragmentariness of the fragments, which is normally the obstacle, it's the reason why people don't approach them, don't consider them, how it can make space for creativity to build a story around them and to build a story around bringing them back to life as they deserve.
It's full of song, it's full of image, it's full of puppetry. I think the way that our team is fusing these together is going to create something that's really quite different from anything you've seen before.